Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Outlaws of Thunder Junction for Timeless. So this is going to be the next set that drops on Arena. I believe it comes out on the 16th, so going to be out early next week, and I'm really excited for this one. You know, as usual with the Timeless set reviews, the bar for cards to see play is very high because the format is so high power level, but we're getting some absolutely crazy additions in this set that I'm really excited to talk about. As usual, I've basically gone through the entire set and just picked out any individual cards that I think are likely to see play, starting off with cards that I think are more likely to have an immediate impact, and then moving more towards the fringe stuff as we go later in the video. Before I get into it, for any MTG Zone Premium members, I've had an article go out today that is basically 5 theory craft decks for Timeless that I've brewed around from new cards, going in depth about them, how I built them, and, you know, basically just ideas that I'm excited to test once the set goes live. I'm also going to be putting out set reviews for Historic and Explorer and also Alchemy over the next few days, and I'll have accompanying articles on the premium site, you know, going over theory craft decks that I built for those formats as well, so keep an eye out for those. I'll have a link to that article down in the description if you want to check it out. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. Starting off here with the card that I think is going to have the biggest immediate impact, and that is Mana Drain. And this card is insane. I think this card is going to be one of the best cards in the whole format because the flaw of this card being Counterspell means that even if you don't have anything to spend the excess mana on, just having a 2-mana Counterspell has already been good, right? We've already seen Counterspell decks have success, whether that's hard control or tempo. And so the flaw when you can't use the mana is already a playable card in Timeless. But if you do have stuff to use the mana on, this card is going to lead to some absolutely insane tempo swings, right? Use this to counter a 2 or 3 drop early, use that mana to cast something, and then still have mana up for further interaction is just going to put you so far ahead. So I think the best current decks that are using actual counterspell are Lurrus decks, both tempo decks and hard control decks as well. And I think this card works perfectly with Lurrus because not only are those shells the best decks that can utilize a 2-mana counterspell like this, but running Lurrus as your companion also just gives you a guaranteed way to spend the excess mana on this. So even if you don't have anything else in your hand to use the mana on, just being able to use that mana to put Lurrus into your hand gives you a guaranteed mana sink for the first one as well. So Lurrus decks definitely seem like the best home for this straight away. And then additionally, I think those sorts of decks can fairly freely run 4 copies of Lorien Revealed as well, which additionally gives you a mana sink both in terms of the land cycling and also if you counter something that costs 3 or more, being able to cast it for 2 mana to draw 3 also seems pretty good as well. So the really nice thing about Mana Drain is I think it's a card that has a really high floor because it's already counterspell, and then an even higher ceiling, and if you're running it alongside Lurrus, you have basically a guaranteed way to use it. So I think this card is going to be absolutely huge in kind of tempo and control decks. Obviously there are some other cards that you can run if you're not running Lurrus that work very well with this. I think the One Ring is a card that hasn't really seen much play, but has been kind of close to playable in my opinion, and Mana Drain definitely helps there, right? Being able to like counter a 3-drop, and then, you know, cast the One Ring, activate it immediately, and still hold open mana for more counter magic seems a pretty insane tempo swing. Then you've got stuff like Wilderness Reclamation as well, and then I've also been working on some like Time Warp loop control decks that use Cyber Siphoner and Ephemerate to continuously loop Time Warp to take infinite turns, and that deck felt close to playable, but the big issue was that it was very mana intensive to get the engines online, and so Mana Drain seems like the perfect addition there as well. My issue with those sorts of decks compared to the Lurrus builds is that those sorts of decks in general are worse overall, right? There's a reason that people prioritize running Lurrus Control over the One Ring and Wilderness Reclamation already, so I feel like for those decks, you're running like a worse overall shell, so I'm not as excited for them as I am in the Lurrus decks, but Mana Drain is obviously going to be a big boon for those kind of control combo decks that have these more expensive cards that you can utilize the Mana Drain mana with. But either way, this card is going to have a huge impact in the format, and I'm really excited to start playing with this one. Then next up we've got actual Reanimate, which is pretty crazy. This is by far the best reanimation spell that we've got in the format, and that kind of highlights my issue with this card in a Reanimator shell in general. I think the big issue with trying to run a full Reanimator deck is just that the next best options are nowhere near as good. So obviously if you're trying to use this to, you know, reanimate very powerful creatures like Atraxa or Gristlebrand, for example, you would need to run a package of discard outlets in order to set that up in the early game. And the issue with doing that is I think if you're spending slots on discard outlets to pitch these big creatures into the graveyard, you really need to be running at least a second reanimation spell, because just having Reanimate as the 4 of isn't consistent enough, especially to find early on. And like I said, the next best options aren't that great. You've got Priest of Fell Rites, but the big issue with that is that you rely on your 2-drop 2/2 surviving, which is just not going to happen in the vast majority of matchups. And then the next best option after that is Victimize, which is a pretty sweet card that we got recently, but the issue with that is that it just requires too much setup. You need 2 creatures in the graveyard and 1 on the battlefield to even cast that in the first place. And then past that, the next best options are 4 mana or, Unburial Rites at 4 mana as well. So I'm not sure that a full Reanimator deck is going to be viable just because the next best options aren't really that good. And I feel like you need more redundancy for this sort of effect for that to be good. And also additionally, I think if you do run a full Reanimator deck, you're just too vulnerable to graveyard hate, especially with Surgical Extraction coming in this set that I'll talk about a little bit later, which is particularly good against Reanimator. So I don't think a full Reanimator deck is the way to go with this yet. If we get something like Persist in a later set, like if it's reprinted in Modern Horizons that is coming to Arena, then I could see Reanimator as a full archetype being good. But the way I see this card being utilized immediately anyway is probably as a small package as part of another deck, if that makes sense. We already see this sort of happening with Death Shadow decks in Legacy, where they'll run Reanimate with the Troll that land cycles. The big issue there is they also have Grief, which is another card that's very good, that pitches itself into the graveyard and is a good Reanimator target. We don't really have good alternatives. Like I said, we do have the Troll of Khazad-dûm, which is a really nice card with Reanimate, but in terms of cards that pitch themselves in the graveyard, the only ones that we've really got is stuff like Perforator Crocodile, which we got from the latest Alchemy set, and this new card that we're getting from Outlaws of Thunder Junction as well, called Harvester of Misery, which is very similar. The big difference is that Perforator Crocodile keeps the -2/-2 once the turn ends, and if the creature survives, it deals 2 damage to them, and you also draw a card for cycling. So I think out of the two, Perforator Crocodile is probably better than Harvester of Misery. And then you've obviously got stuff like Trumpeting Carnosaur as well, but the big issue with all 3 of these cards is that they're very slow, and they also only really effective if the opponent's running small creatures, right? You can only pitch this and Trumpeting Carnosaur in the graveyard if the opponent has targets for it, which not every deck does, and then, they're not guaranteed to win you the game, especially if the opponent's playing a combo deck like Show and Tell as well. So I don't think the self-pitching idea is as good in Timeless without Grief. So I'm not sure what the best home for this is immediately. I did put together a build in the premium article that I'm talking about that combines Reanimate with Sorin and Expensive Vampires, which could be an interesting way to build it. But I'm not exactly sure what the best home for this is, but I would be shocked if this card doesn't see play somewhere, right? The power level is so high on this, but like I said, I don't think a full Reanimator deck is going to be that viable. So I think if this does see play immediately, it's going to be as a small package as part of another deck. It'd be very interesting to see what the refined lists running Reanimate end up being. And if you've got any ideas of how you're going to use Reanimate, definitely let me know in the comments, because this is one that I feel like I haven't really come up with the best idea for yet, but the power level is there for sure, and this is definitely going to be one that's going to continue seeing play in the future, just because it's such a powerful card. Then next up we got Surgical Extraction, which is a really interesting addition to the format. So this is going to be a really nice sideboard card against any deck that is utilizing the graveyard. So like I talked about, we could get Reanimator as a viable archetype going forwards because we're just getting Reanimate, and Surgical Extraction is obviously sick against Reanimator. You can fizzle there, Reanimate, and then exile all the additional copies of the reanimation target as well. There's obviously decks like Is It Phoenix, which haven't really been too popular because of Orcish Bowmasters, but if you are against Phoenix, using this to exile all the Arc-like Phoenixes seems really good as well. So any graveyard deck this seems really nice against. Then I've seen quite a few people talking about this as an answer to Show and Tell as well, which I can understand why, because, turn 1 Thoughtseize, get rid of the Show and Tell, into Extract It, get rid of all the additional copies, is going to win games against Show and Tell, but I'm slightly less optimistic about that, because the only way for this to be an effective tool against Show and Tell is if you can get Show and Tell into the graveyard without letting them combo off, and there's only really 3 ways that you can do that. First of all is with Mill, and I'm going to talk about Mill in a little bit more detail later, because we are getting another card from this set, which could make Mill a viable archetype. So milling the opponent and then extracting it does seem like a really interesting way to fight the deck. And the other 2 ways are discard spells and counter spells. And my issue with those is that I think Mill is the only deck that you can really afford to main deck Surgical Extraction in. I think any deck running discard spells and counter spells in high numbers, Extraction is just going to be a completely dead card in so many matchups that it's not worth doing. So if you are bringing this in against Show and Tell, first of all, I think for it to be effective, your deck needs to be running a high density of discard spells, counter spells, or both, because if you draw this without a discard spell or a counter spell, it's just going to be doing nothing against Show and Tell, which already pretty drastically reduces the number of decks that you can run this in if that is your goal. But the other issue is if you are bringing this in post sideboard, the Show and Tell player is going to have access to 4 Veil of Summer and some number of Leyline of Sanctity, which makes it really difficult for your your discard spells and your counter spells to consistently get the show and tell in the graveyard, because they have good ways to fight against them. Additionally, if you're running discard spells, even if you do get it off through Veil of Summer or Leyline of Sanctity, if they don't have show and tell in their hand, then it's not going to be that effective either, right? Obviously, you could hit like an Attraction or Omniscience and then extract it, but then they still have the other one in their deck alongside the show and tell. So even if you open Thoughtseize Extraction, if they just happen to have kept a hand with, tutors and no show and tell and no Omniscience, then it doesn't do that much either. Then Surgical Extraction is still a dead card in your hand, and you have to dig for another discard spell or counter spell. And then with counter spells, it's much easier for the opponent to play slowly, sandbag the show and tell until they have like Thoughtseize or Veil of Summer backup. They can obviously wait until the game goes longer, and then if they get to a point where they have an uncracked fetch lands and 3 other lands, they can potentially crack a fetch in response to Extraction to get Mystic Sanctuary and put it on top. So I feel like there's a lot of things that need to go right for this to be an effective answer against show and tell, which makes me think that it's probably not going to be as impactful as existing options that we've got, like Roiling Vortex and some other options that we're getting in this set as well that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And then on top of that as well, with the addition of Mana Drain, I wouldn't be at all surprised if I see more experimentation in the control combo builds of show and tell, similar to the version that Puri was running in the latest Timeless Open, in which case those sorts of decks can fairly freely run some other win condition like Cryptic Coat, for example, which makes Extraction not as effective either as well. So I feel like Extraction, I'm mainly excited for it against graveyard decks. Now again, I'm sure it will win some games if you do go Thoughtseize into Extraction, but the fact that this is a dead card when that doesn't line up makes me worry about the consistency of this card as an answer to show and tell, but time will tell. But either way, I think this is a really interesting addition to the format, and I think it's a cool answer to graveyard decks going forwards. And then speaking of show and tell, next card I want to talk about is Abrupt Decay, because I think this card is going to be a really big addition for the show and tell decks, because it basically answers every single commonly played hate card against you. It answers the non-creature stuff like Roiling Vortex, Rule of Law, Deafening Silence, and then also kills the creature options like Boromir and Lavinia, because it can't be countered, right? So the way that Boromir and Lavinia are effective answers to Omniscience is that they counter anything that you cast off the Omniscience once it's in play. So if you go show and tell, you put an Omniscience in play, opponent puts a Boromir into play, you can just immediately fire off Abrupt Decay, kill their Boromir, and then just combo off. So this definitely seems like it's going to be a slam dunk in the sideboard of show and tell, and I could even potentially see this seeing play in the main deck, because I think one of the weaknesses of the current show and tell builds is that they don't have good ways to fight against creatures that overwhelm on the board, and they also don't really have a good way to fight against decks that are main decking hate cards. I think one of the main reasons that Naya Winota has such a powerful, or has such a good matchup against show and tell, is because it can afford to main deck Boromir in 7 copies because of the Grizzled Huntmaster, and having main deck Abrupt Decay seems like a very versatile card that's going to be good in most matchups, and also just gives you a way to answer cards like Boromir straight away, which could potentially help improve that matchup quite a lot. So Abrupt Decay, I'm not sure if it's really good enough to see play elsewhere. Maybe the mid-range decks like Jund's might be interested in this, but this definitely seems like the best home for this is going to be show and tell, because it just answers all of the commonly played hate cards. I'm going to have to search and see if I can find any hate cards that cost 4 or more, because this could very well be the card that decides what hate is viable against show and tell. And honestly, having looked at other options, I'm not really sure there's much great stuff. So this could be a card that makes show and tell even more resilient, which I'm a little bit concerned about. And then next up we got Archive Trap. So this is the card that I was talking about that I think could potentially make Mill a viable strategy. Now I'm not 100% sure how viable Mill will be as a deck, because on its face, it does seem like a deck that should have quite polarizing matchups where, you're good against the decks that are slower to commit to the battlefield. I am pretty excited because it does seem in theory like it could have a good show and tell matchup, because you can mill their show and tell over, and then Surgical Extraction. Like I said, I think Surgical Extraction is a big deal for the Mill deck because it gives you a way to fight against the more high synergy decks like show and tell. And then there's other cards that you can hit very nicely as well, like Primeval Titan, Winota, Yawgmoth, Natural Order, that really limit your opponent's options as well. So Surgical Extraction is a big deal for Mill, but Archive Trap alone is just the biggest power boost to Mill, because once the opponent's drawn their 7-card hand and their card for the turn, if they crack a fetch on turn 1 and you Archive Trap them, milling 13 cards is like a quarter of their deck at that point, which really increases the deck's speed and consistency. Like I said, basically every deck is running fetch lands, so you should be able to cast this for 0 mana within the first few turns fairly consistently. And we do have a number of other good mill tools. We've got Glimpse the Unthinkable, we've still got Mesmeric Orb, which then also mills yourself, and then once you're milling yourself, you can use Treasure Cruise as a way to refuel because I think one of the big differences between the Timeless card pool and a card pool like Modern is that they have extra tools to allow you to refuel that we're missing in Timeless. But obviously in Timeless we have Treasure Cruise, which does a very similar thing, especially if you are filling your own graveyard with fetch lands that you would want to run for Ruin Crab anyway. So I'm excited to try Mill. I do feel like it probably will struggle against the creature decks. Against Lurrus decks, you obviously have stuff like Tasha's Hideous Laughter, but I'm not sure if that's really a main deck card, because in Timeless there are already a lot of cards that are expensive that are seeing play, like Leyline Binding, the Land Cyclers, Natural Order, and the big creature package that goes along with that. And then obviously decks like Winota are running Agent of Treachery as well. So Tasha's Hideous Laughter again seems like a card that's going to be very polarizing in what matchups it's good against, but at least with Hideous Laughter you have a good sideboard tool at least against the Lurrus decks. But past that, I think you're going to struggle against decks like Domain Zoo and Winota, for example, but we'll have to see. Archive Trap really does increase the power level and the speed of the Mill decks, so I do expect it to be a viable deck. I'm just not sure it's going to be tier 1, but either way I'm excited to try it out. And then we're also getting another trap from this set in Mindbreak Trap, which is an interesting addition. So this is obviously first of all going to be good against the Storm based combos, right, against decks like Underworld Breach or the Beseech Storm deck, because once they combo off and then they cast their, you know, Tendrils of Agony or Grape Shot or whatever their win condition is, you can just Mindbreak Trap that and exile all the copies of that on the stack, which seems pretty nice. And then additionally, when I first saw this card, I was quite excited about this as a potential answer to Show and Tell in any colour, because a lot of the current builds of Show and Tell are only running a single copy of Mastermind's Acquisition, so you could potentially let them go Show and Tell Omniscience, dig through their deck until they find the Mastermind's Acquisition, and then Mindbreak Trap that, and then they have no more ways to get stuff from their sideboard, and they're reliant on just beating down with the Atraxa. But you know, the more I thought about that, the more I felt like it's only going to be able to get very specific builds of Show and Tell. If the opponent ends up running 2 copies of Mastermind's Acquisition, or 1 Masterminds, 1 Fae of Wishes, which a number of builds are running, then this card virtually does nothing, because once they have Omniscience in play, they can just go through their whole deck. So even if you exile the first Mastermind's Acquisition, they can fairly easily just find their second sideboard tutors. So I'm not really sure it's going to be great there, but if the Storm combo deck starts seeing a lot of play, then this is a pretty interesting option in the sideboard, because any deck can run it once it costs 0 mana, which is pretty nice. And then next up we got Force of Vigor, which is a really interesting addition. I was really hoping that we get the full Force cycle. I really wanted to get Force of Negation, but Force of Vigor is still a pretty nice one. Now I don't really think this is going to see play straight away, because there aren't really many decks built around artifacts and enchantments where this card would be really good. Obviously there are some decks that care about specific artifacts and enchantments, like Titanfield cares about Blood Moon, and then obviously Show and Tell cares about Roiling Vortex, but I think those decks both have better answers for those specific cards. I think this is only going to be good against decks that have a high density of artifacts and enchantments as part of their proactive game plan, which doesn't really exist in Timeless right now, but this is definitely a sleeper card that I'm sure is going to see play going forwards. You know, we're obviously going to get Modern Horizons 3 pretty soon as well, which is probably going to have a bunch of powerful artifacts and enchantments in, and if a deck is built around those, like Affinity, or if we get an Urza Saga reprint, for example, then I'm sure this will see play there. So this is a card that I don't expect to see play straight away, but this is definitely a card that is going to be able to keep those artifacts and enchantment decks in check as they get more powerful going forwards. Then next up we've got Commandeer, which is another free spell, so we're getting a lot of free spells for the first time in Timeless, which is really interesting. This one I'm not really sure has a good application straight away though. I believe this saw play in Modern recently when the Up the Beanstalk decks were everywhere, because it not only allows you to steal your opponent's Up the Beanstalk, but also triggers your own, so it kind of mitigates a lot of the downside of having to exile 2 cards in addition to this. But right now this doesn't really seem playable in Timeless, because the only, you know, non-creature card that's commonly seen play is Show and Tell, and Commandeer is, you know, basically ineffective against Show and Tell because it's symmetrical. So this definitely seems similar to Force of Vigor, like another card to bear in mind going forwards. And if another non-creature combo deck or another deck built around expensive, powerful non-creatures sees play, this could be a good way to counteract that. So definitely one to bear in mind going forwards, but unless I'm missing something, this doesn't really seem like it's going to be good in the current metagame at least. And then next up we've got Path to Exile, which is an interesting addition. So obviously this is significantly worse than Swords to Plowshares, but Swords to Plowshares is probably the best creature removal spell in the whole format, so being worse than that doesn't necessarily mean that this will be unplayable. And if you are running specifically blue-white control, this is an interesting option to consider as 1 mana removal in addition to Swords to Plowshares. Obviously Fragment Reality is the other option that you need to consider there, but Path to Exile is an option there. Having said that, I think one of the main reasons that you would want to run 1 mana removal in addition to Swords to Plowshares is to answer 1-drops like Delighted Halfling, Ragavan, Deathrite Shaman, for example. And Path to Exile is at its worst when you use it on turn 1, because the downside is much worse earlier in the game. So If you are having to run more 1-mana removal specifically for 1-drops, I think Fragment Reality is the better option, but this is a notable addition, and if you are running blue-white control, this is a card to consider if you felt like you wanted more cheap interaction in addition to Swords to Plowshares. And then next up we got Skullcrack. So if this card is going to see play anywhere, it's obviously going to be in a burn deck, and I think if it's going to see play in burn, it's going to be in the sideboard as a way to counteract incidental life gain like Uro and Oko, for example. My big issue with that though is that I just think Roiling Vortex does the same thing, but it's just much better right now because it's really good against Show and Tell. So I don't really expect Skullcrack to see play while Show and Tell is a big part of the metagame. The damage can't be prevented this turn is also relevant against certain cards like Sarah's Emissary and the One Ring, for example. So if those cards start seeing a lot of play, then you could consider running this there as well, but in the current metagame, I just don't think this is likely to see play because Vortex is just so much better in the current metagame. So next up we got a really iconic one in Stoneforge Mystic, and I'm so excited that they're adding this. I've really wanted to play with this on Arena for a long time now. To be quite honest though, I think this is a card that is going to have a much bigger impact in Historic compared to Timeless, and I'm going to go into more detail that in my Historic and Explorer set review, but I just think the disparity in power level between the two formats means that Stoneforge Mystic is probably going to be too slow. Hammer Time, for example, we have a lot of tools to enable, but we don't really gain anything moving from Historic to Timeless, and the power level of the format is just so much higher that I don't think a deck like that is likely to be impactful. So I think if Stoneforge Mystic is going to see play in Timeless, it's most likely going to see play in a control deck, because Stoneforge Mystic can grab both Cryptic Coat, which is a really nice control finisher that we've seen added recently, and additionally we get another new card in this set called Assimilation Aegis, which is another really nice choose target of Stoneforge Mystic, because it's basically a fetchable removal spell, right? This comes down and exiles a creature of any size, so, you know, not limited like a lot of the artifact and enchantment removal is, and then the creature that you exiled with it becomes, the creature that you equip this to becomes a copy of the creature that you exiled with it. So if you exile a Primeval Titan and then equip this to the Stoneforge Mystic becomes a copy of Primeval Titan, which is pretty sick. So this does mean that I think Stoneforge Mystic does have a very nice toolbox in controlling shells. My issue with that though is that I think the way control needs to be playing in the format right now is holding up interaction every single turn, especially while Show and Tell is a really popular deck. So having to tap out for Stoneforge Mystic, Cryptic Coat and Assimilation Aegis makes me think that these versions of control are likely going to be worse than the more draw-go versions of control. So I wouldn't really be surprised if Stoneforge Mystic doesn't really have much of an impact at all in Timeless, which is a bit sad, but I think this card is definitely going to be a big player in Historic, and I'm very excited to play with it there at the very least. So next up we've got High Noon, which is a really nice addition to the format because it's basically Rule of Law but 1 mana cheaper. You do also have an additional upside of being able to deal 5 damage, but I think in Timeless that's basically never going to come up. So Rule of Law is already a card that I was running in the sideboard of fair white decks as a hate piece against Show and Tell, and High Noon just being 1 mana cheaper is just a pretty significant upgrade on that. Now the main reason why I was running these two over cards like Deafening Silence, for example, is that these sorts of hate pieces are first of all meant to stop the opponent from comboing off with Omniscience, but it's also meant to slow them down so that your fair game plan can race them. And the downside of running Deafening Silence is that it enables the opponent to go Show and Tell into Omniscience and then immediately cast an Attraxer, which makes it very difficult for your fair game plan to fight that. Cards like High Noon and Rule of Law basically force the opponent to wait an additional turn cycle to cast that Attraxer, which can often make the difference between winning and losing. And then the big reason why I was running, Rule of Law and now High Noon over alternatives like Boromir is that they're just generally less vulnerable to interaction, right? The downside of Boromir is that it can be killed by both Fatal Push and bypassed by Veil of Summer as well. So these enchantments are typically safer and less vulnerable to the opponent's removal. Now, having said that, the one concern I have about cards like High Noon and Rule of Law going forwards is that if Abrupt Decay becomes a very common card, especially in the main deck, then the advantage of running High Noon over something like Boromir becomes less impactful, so we'll have to see going forwards, but I'm definitely going to slam dunk this in the sideboard of my Titan deck, where I want to be running white in that list anyway, because you want to be able to fetch Boromir with Archdruid's Charm game 1 to give you a way to fight against the Show and Tell decks, and you also want Get Lost in the sideboard to be able to answer cards like Ashiok and Virulent Plague as well as Blood Moon as well. So that's a deck where, for example, you want to go into white as opposed to red, so definitely going to be running it there. Hopefully Abrupt Decay doesn't make it unplayable though, we'll have to see. So next up we got Jace Reawakened, which is one of the most interesting cards from the set. I think it's one of the most difficult cards to evaluate because it's pretty unlike any card we've seen before. It's the first 2-mana Planeswalker that we're getting on Arena, and it's also the first card that you can't cast until turn 4, which is a really interesting clause as well. So I could definitely be wrong on this because I think it is quite difficult to evaluate, but I could see this card being pretty good, especially because I think, like I said, Lurrus Control is going to be the best variant of Control initially anyway, and getting to run a Planeswalker alongside Lurrus seems really nice. So In terms of the ability of not being able to cast it before turn 4, that is definitely a drawback. I'm sure there will be some games where you really want to be able to cast this on turn 2, but if you're playing a draw-go control shell with stuff like Mana Drain and Counterspell, Fatal Push and Dig Through Time, for example, you probably don't really want to be casting this until turn 4 anyway, because you want to keep holding mana open every single turn. And the really nice thing about casting this on turn 4 is you don't miss a turn of holding mana open for something like Mana Drain, right? Hits turn 4, as long as you got your 4th land, you can cast the Jace Reawakened and then plus it, and still have mana open for Mana Drain, for Fatal Push, for Dig Through Time, whatever you want to cast that turn. In terms of the abilities, the first ability to loot seems pretty nice, right? I think it basically just not only fuels your graveyard for stuff like Dig Through Time, Snapcaster Maze, but basically just makes sure you don't draw dead. Very good at filtering away lands, very good at just digging you towards what you need. You will see a pretty high density of cards, plussing this every single turn. Now, the big weakness of this ability is it does make you weak to Bowmasters, but having said that, if you're playing Blue-Black Control, you're probably already running 4 Brainstorms, so you should be pretty equipped to answer Bowmasters, whether that's with Fatal Push, Stern Scolding, your own Orcish Bowmasters, any other type of black removal as well. So I feel like if you're running a Blue-Black Control deck with Brainstorm, you probably already want to have a high density of cards to be able to answer Bowmasters, so I'm hoping that plus ability isn't as much of an issue if you're already well prepared to answer the card Bowmasters specifically. Then the second ability to plot a card is very interesting. Now, you might not think that that's very relevant in a draw-go control deck because you can't cast plot cards at instant speed. They have to be cast at sorcery speed. But I think it works very nicely with 2 cards. First of all, if you're running Lurrus, being able to, potentially Mana Drain, put Lurrus into your hand, and then plus this to plot the Lurrus, allows you to cast Lurrus for free the following turn, while still holding all of your mana up. So, again, similar to the advantage of Jace, being able to plot Lurrus enables you to just constantly hold mana up the whole time, which is very nice to be able to interact with the opponent. You don't have to go shields down as much, which is pretty nice. But the second card I'm very excited to try alongside this, and this was brought up by Aspiring Spike in his initial set video, definitely recommend checking that out if you're a modern player, is alongside Valki, God of Lies, because if you plot Valki with Jace Reawakened, you get to cast this on the Tibalt side as a 5-mana the 7-mana Planeswalker. It's not showing it here, but it's a really powerful card that can snowball the game. So the big drawback of running this is that having to run Valki in Timeless sucks, right? This card is just way, way too underpowered for Timeless. The casting it as a 2-drop is going to be, you might want to do it in some games, but it's dies to Bowmasters, just very low impact card in general. But I think the ability to have this in a Lurrus control deck really fixes the main issues I have with the deck as a whole. I think the current builds of Blue-Black Control, the main issues I have with them is that their proactive game plan is just so small ball, right? The way that the main meta builds of Blue-Black Lurrus Control, pioneered by people like Missman, for example, you typically just grind the opponent out and then end up closing the game out with Bowmasters and Lurrus, basically. So not only is it difficult to press the advantage because your proactive game plan isn't that big, but it's also really difficult to recover from behind if the opponent resolves something big against you. So running Valki not only enables you to really apply pressure when you do have the advantage to stop the opponent, it gives the opponent less time to draw out of their situation, but it also gives you a way to recover from behind, which I think is one of the big weaknesses of the current Lurrus control list. Now, obviously, like I said, the weakness of running a card like Valki is that it's pretty bad to draw, but I think you could potentially run Jace as a 3 or 4 of. I think this card is fine as a 4 of because of the first ability allows you to loot additional copies away, and then you could just run Valki as a 2 of, which you can dig towards with cards like Jace, with cards like Dig Through Time or Memory Deluge, whatever you want to run, as to give the deck kind of a combo burst, which fix kind of the small ball issues that I have with the Dimir deck. Now, having said that, I think whether that sort of strategy is good largely depends on how good Jace is itself. I think running Valki alongside Jace is kind of predicated that Jace is good itself, and like I said, it's a hard card to evaluate. There could be a chance that Jace isn't good enough, in which case this whole package probably isn't worth it. But if Jace is good enough, I do like the idea of running a couple of copies of Valki just to give the deck a way to go over the top of the opponent, a way to recover from behind. Now, you might be thinking that this is at best a turn 5 Tibalt, which isn't the most powerful thing to be doing in Timeless, where people are casting Necropotence on turn 1 or winning with Show and Tell on turn 3. But the big difference here is that it's Tibalt on turn 5 for 0 mana, and you never take a turn off from holding up interaction. You have counter spells up every turn, you have interaction up every turn, which is a really big deal. So I'm excited to try it out. And then finally, the -6, the ultimate. I think it's likely to win you the game. And the nice thing about this as well is that, the downside of this possibility is it does nothing unless you have Lurrus or Valky. But if you don't have Lurrus or Valky, I think you're pretty happy to just keep using the other +1 ability. And you do get to the -6 fairly quickly. It doesn't take that long as well. So I could envisage some games just being won by Jace on its own, which is pretty nice. So again, very hard card to evaluate, but if Jace is good, I do think this package of Jace Valky is pretty nice. And if you want an idea of, my initial sample list, I have this deck built as one of the Theorycraft lists in the premium article that I'll have linked in the description. Then next up we got Satoru the Infiltrator, which is another card that I think is potentially very, very powerful. So this basically draws you a card if a creature enters, a non-token creature enters the battlefield and it wasn't cast. And there's a ton of ways to enable this. So first of all, this is another card kind of similar to Stoneforge Mystic that I think is likely to have a much bigger impact in Historic, where Ninjas is already a deck, and this card seems really sick in Ninjas. You can trigger it by casting Ornithopter, you can trigger it by using Retrofit Foundry. There's a lot of ways that you can trigger it, or also just using any ninjutsu ability triggers this as well. So there's a lot of ways that you can trigger it there. In Timeless, there are still a number of ways you can do it, but I think you have to jump through a lot of hoops to set it up. So the main way I think of that you could use it in Timeless is in a Sacrifice Shell. You've got stuff like Cat Oven, you've got stuff like Bloodghast and Goblin Bombardment that you can loop, and this seems like a really sick card advantage engine there. But having said that, Grix, you'd have to run Grixis Sacrifice. I think Sacrifice on its own already isn't in the best position because of Show and Tell as well. And obviously drawing loads of cards into Orcish Bowmasters is a little bit awkward as well. Now obviously if you're running Goblin Bombardment, that's much less of an issue because that can just immediately kill the Bowmasters. So I'm going to be theory crafting and building maybe like a Grixis Sacrifice Shell, because you do gain Cauldron Familiar being able to block in Timeless, which is a nice upgrade. But again, I think this could be a card that is more is going to be much bigger in Historic initially anyway. But having said that, going forwards, this does seem like a card that has an incredibly high ceiling. I think this card gets better and better as more unfair things get added to the format. So this is a card that I'm not sure we'll see massive play immediately, but this is definitely a card I'd have on my radar, especially when MH3 gets spoiled, if they have a bunch of ways to cheat on mana and have free spells like they have had in the past with something like the Pitch Cycle of Elementals. Then speaking of Sacrifice, I think another card that could go very well alongside Goblin Bombardment is Forsaken Miner, which is whenever you commit a crime, you can play black and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. So obviously this works very, very well with Goblin Bombardment, because Bombardment commits a crime every time you target the opponent, so you can basically just loop this with Bombardment for as much black mana as you have. Same thing with Satoru though. I think Goblin Bombardment as a card isn't that good in Timeless right now, mainly because of Show and Tell. I think if Show and Tell ends up getting restricted, or ends up, after MH3 gets printed, ends up being not as big of a player in the format, then there's more room for a deck like Sacrifice to appear. Outside of that, there are obviously other ways that you can trigger the Forsaken Miner, but I think to really maximize this, you do need to have a repeatable Sacrifice outlet. So if Goblin Bombardment decks do emerge again, I think this is a really nice tool that you could potentially run alongside them. And then next up we've got Aven Interrupter, which I really like the look of this card. It's very reminiscent of something like Spell Queller. So 3 mana flash flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target spell on the stack, then it becomes plotted, and it costs 2 more to cast as long as Aven Interrupters on the battlefield. So it's kind of like, a combination of Spell Queller and Elite Spellbinder in a way. So if you're running like a Death and Taxes style deck, or kind of like a tempo style deck where you want to be able to apply pressure and slow down what the opponent's doing, this seems like a really nice option. And then it has some nice synergy with blink cards as well. So if you're running like Ephemerate, you could potentially use this to counter more stuff on the stack, which seems pretty interesting as well. Now obviously 3 mana is a lot in Timeless, but if you're running other creatures that are good at taxing the opponent, to be able to get to 3 mana fairly consistently without being too far behind, then this seems like a really interesting option. So I'm really excited to try this one out. Again, like a lot of the other creatures, I think this is one that is likely to have more of an impact in a format like Historic or Explorer, where the power level is generally lower. But I also do think this has a chance in Timeless because, there are a lot of decks that are trying to cast powerful, expensive cards like Show and Tell, like Natural Order, for example. And even Interrupter seems like a really nice way to disrupt those sorts of strategies. Then next up we've got Grand Abolisher, which is a really interesting addition to the format as well. So this is really good in any deck that wants to be able to fight against counter spells. And this seems like a really nice option, especially with the printing of Mana Drain. I think with the printing of Mana Drain, there's going to be a pretty big upswing in both control and tempo decks that rely on counter spells to be able to interact with you in a lot of ways. And having a 2-drop that can often get under those sorts of counter spells, especially if you're on the play, seems like a really nice tool at fighting against those sorts of decks. So I'm not sure what the best home for this is initially. I think if there is a Death and Taxes style deck, then this seems like a good sideboard card. Additionally, decks like Winota have struggled specifically against counter spells, so if you can fix the mana base to consistently get double white on turn 2, this seems like an interesting option there as well. But overall, I think this is a very nice option to have, especially in creature decks if you want to improve your matchup against counter spells and other instant speed interaction. And additionally as well, if you are running a combo deck, this seems like a nice way to fight against counter spells, but there aren't too many combo decks that can consistently cast double white on turn 2. Obviously fetch lands help with that, but either way, I definitely expect this to be a good option going forwards. Then next up we've got Slickshot Show-Off, which again I think this is a card that I'm more excited for in Historic, but I still think this card could have potential in Timeless. So this is, well, the general idea with this card is that you can plot it on turn 2 and then cast it on turn 3 and have protection up for it. So these sorts of creatures that are very high impact if they live are obviously at their weakest against removal spells like Fatal Push and Lightning Bolt. So if you are running a tempo deck with a lot of counter spells or ways to fight on the stack, being able to plot this and then cast it for free on turn 3 and have mana up to defend it. You know, if you can figure out a way to build wizards in Timeless, then it's a nice way that you can guarantee a wizard in play for Flame of Anor on turn 3. So just being able to plot this and have a threat that can apply a lot of pressure that you can also back up with interaction the following turn is pretty nice. Now, having said that, a lot of tempo decks typically don't want to take turns off early in the game because they want to hold up counter spells, so there's a little bit of awkwardness there. You might prefer to just run 1-drops instead, but I think the power level of this card is high enough that it was definitely worth bringing up. Then next up we got Torpor Orb, which is a really interesting addition to the format. I think this is a really nice sideboard tool going forwards. Now, having said that, I don't think this is likely to see a ton of play immediately. I think, you know, the only deck that immediately comes to mind that this is pretty good against is Titanfield, because it stops the Primeval Titan triggers, but, you know, unlike Strict Proctor, it doesn't shut down Field of the Dead, so I don't really expect this one to see play immediately unless there's a deck I'm forgetting about that is very reliant on creature ETBs. But as more creatures get added to the format, I could definitely envisage a deck or multiple decks that are very, you know, reliant on ETBs from creatures, and this is just a really nice tool that any deck can run to be able to shut those sorts of strategies down. And then continuing on the theme of sideboard cards, we've got Pest Control here, which 2 mana sorcery destroys all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less, and can cycle for 2 mana as well, so it gives you some flexibility if it's not good when you draw it. But this definitely seems like a sideboard card that isn't great in the current metagame, but I can definitely envisage metagames where this is good, especially if there's a Lurrus deck that runs a lot of cheap artifacts, or, you know, a deck that produces a bunch of tokens, for example. This seems like a pretty nice tool there. So again, not one that I expect to see play immediately, but definitely have this one on your radar, because there will be certain metagames and certain specific decks that this will be very effective against going forwards. And then finally we've got Ruthless Lawbringer, which I don't expect to see play in multiples ever. I think this is nice as a Chord of Calling tutor target. So if you're running an Abzan deck with Chord of Calling, being able to tutor for this, sacrifice one of your other creatures and just kill any permanent seems really nice flexibility to be able to answer any problematic card the opponent might have. So this is another card that I think is probably likely to have much bigger impact in Historic than Timeless straight away, because there's already some Chord of Calling decks there that are in Abzan, stuff like Yawgmoth and Samwise. But if Abzan Chord of Calling decks do become popular in Timeless, this is definitely a good option to consider going forwards as well. You know, I've already seen some people playing stuff like Amalia, so could very well fit in there if Chord decks become popular here as well. So those are all the cards that I wanted to highlight. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's anything from the set that I missed, or if there's any applications of these cards that I didn't talk about as well, because obviously Timeless is a really big format. There's a bunch of cool stuff you can do, and there very well could be some stuff that I missed from this set, because it is quite a big set with the main set and the bonus sheets and all that stuff coming with it as well. And like I said, I'm going to be doing set reviews for Historic and Explorer and Alchemy on the channel as well, so keep your eyes peeled for that on the YouTube channel over the next few days. And I'm going to be making more Theorycraft articles for the premium site as well. The next one going up will be covering Historic and Explorer, so if you're a premium member, keep your eyes on the site for those coming out. Either way, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up!